We'll go ahead and get started then and see how far we can get. Thanks everybody for joining us, and welcome to all those that have come to participate in today, which is our fourth virtual speaker series event. These are held by Peterborough County Stewardship. And for those of you that don't know, PCS is a nonprofit corporation dedicated to the wise use of soil, water, woodlands, wetlands, wildlife, and other natural resources on private land. Our board of directors is made up of local landowners and agency representatives. PCS is a community-based organization with a vision for landowners and organizations to work together in order to promote sustainability and stewardship of natural resources within the county. Our speaker series is a recurring event whereby we connect local subject matter experts with residents of the county to provide learning opportunities and sharing of knowledge that can lead to increased awareness and engagement in stewardship activities within our community. Tonight, we're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Susan Woodbohm. Dr. Woodbohm's particular area of expertise in the role that biological systems such as agriculture and forestry play in climate change mitigation and adaptation have actually influenced policy and investment decisions at the provincial and national levels through her work with Queen's University and NGOs in Ontario and Alberta, as well as within global organizations such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Dr. Woodbohm will take us on an adventure as to whether or not tree discussions belong in the fantastical worlds of Wizard of Oz and Avatar, or can new research and plant physiology and ecology support such subtle interactions in the real world? And how and when trees talk, and what lessons may they teach us? Before I pass it over to Dr. Woodbohm, there's just a couple quick housekeeping notes. All participant videos have been turned off, as well as the microphones, just to ensure a stable internet connection as much as possible. The chat box has been enabled, so you'll be able to use that throughout the presentation. And we encourage you to pose your questions or comments there, and feel free to say hi to one another. We won't actually have a Q&A session until the end, and I'll record all of your questions and we'll provide them back to Susan at the end of the presentation. Feel free to use the emoji and reaction buttons throughout the chat as you find interesting content throughout the presentation. And as well, the final note is that the presentation itself will be recorded and then uploaded to our PCS website, as well as the YouTube account for anybody to access later. And don't worry about any personal information being shared at all, as it will be solely the video of the presentation and the Q&A session itself. And so with that said, I'm now going to pass it over to Susan, who can introduce herself and start the presentation.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was a lovely introduction, and I think we're just going to go right here. Let me see. Oh, you know what? I have to share my screen first. You think I was a Zoom rookie? Okay. Now, does that? No. That's not got it, has it? Okay, I can't tell, Scott, if you're seeing my screen or not.
Yep, I can see your screen, Susan.
Perfect.
There you go.
How does that look? Oh,
that's great.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I appreciate the lovely introduction. That was wonderful too. I chose the talk, Whispering Pines, Murmuring, Mycorhizae, for this talk about communication, because I think when we think about communication, we're thinking about sending and receiving signals. And in a human context, of course, that would be sending something by the voice and receiving it by the ear. Obviously, trees don't have voices or ears, but they do send signals. And I think we're going to go through a bit of introduction tonight on how that occurs. In the time that I have, I can just barely scratch the surface, but I hope it'll be enough to keep you all intrigued. Now, I have to acknowledge that despite our Zoom format tonight, which I hope will work because I'm on kind of an unstable rural internet, Zoom allows us to come together from all sorts of different areas. But okay. But what we do know is that the Peterborough Stewardship Council meets on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga, and that's important particularly tonight because we're going to be talking about what both ancient and modern peoples have held in their long beliefs and what we're learning more through science and modern understanding about the the language of the forest. For context, because it's important that we're all on the same page, I wanted to remind you that about a third of the Earth's land mass is covered by trees. That's a heck of a lot. And one third of that is covered by the boreal coniferous forest, which we call the taiga. A huge amount of that exists in Canada. It's the largest biome on the Earth, and it contributes to a major role in controlling some very significant cycles. These are the cycles relating to carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and water. And that's a fairly high level approach, but it's just so important that I think it's that we need to be aware of that as we start our talk tonight. So I'm really going to cover four basic things tonight. I'm going to talk about why forest communication is important and how it works. We'll talk a little bit about some recent discussions on the topic because it's been in the news a lot, and there's a lot of different opinions about it, shall we say. And then we'll finish up by talking about climate change, and hopefully there'll be time enough for lots of questions if you have them. I wanted to start with this photo. It's taken at our home, which is on a farm just east of Peterborough. And I had a number of reasons for sharing it with you. First of all, it features that guy that's down at the bottom. His name's Mike Bohm. He's my husband. And he's also a member of the Peterborough Stewardship Council. And he's the one who got me into this, this role of talking about forest communications with you. I also wanted to make sure at this point that I offer you a disclaimer. I am not a forester. I have huge respect for foresters, but I'm not one. I have some expertise with soil microbes, however, and the interactions that they have with roots, and that's going to be of use in this conversation. I have a pretty good background in plant physiology and in biochemistry. I did stay awake for those lectures, and those are useful skills for the discussion as well. But as you've already heard, my real expertise is in climate change and the role of biological systems in helping us to address the issues of climate change. So you're going to have to put up with a bit of that because I think that's where this communication becomes exceptionally important. The photo is also a good one because it demonstrates some of the key characteristics of forests. This is an ancient forest, and so you'll see that it has trees of different ages and sizes. It has different species. It's got a really good understory, and light penetrates through the forest all the way to the ground. It's on a side hill, so it's got some interesting hydrologic features, but you probably can't really tell. But it does show us something else. If this was a video and not just a static photo, you'd see that Mike was moving. And aside from a few leaves and branches moving in the wind, the trees are not. And it sounds so simple, but it's critically important. Trees are what we call sessile. That means that they're stuck in one place. They're literally rooted to the ground. They can't move to go and get what they want and need in order to support the growth and development and reproduction. Neither can they run away when something comes after them. So they have to develop different systems to get what they need and to fend off pests and whatever else might damage the trees. So it's really important. It's something that we sort of forget about when we talk about trees, but it really is an important aspect. Let me see where we're going next. So forest communication is important in a lot of different ways. There are considerable advantages to sharing and becoming a multi-party unit versus competition. So we've long thought about trees as loners, trying to fight for the resources that they need. But in fact, trees behave as a colony, and there are advantages to that. I think one of the simplest things I can explain to you is if you think about one tree in a fence row, and you think what happens when the wind blows, it has nobody to share that stress with. It's blowing around. Oftentimes branches get broken. Sometimes it'll get uprooted or it'll get damaged. Where if a tree is amongst others of its same kind, they share those stresses. So it's that group of advantages to sharing versus competition. Not all individuals can have total access to the canopy, the top part of the tree. And so not all trees can have the same access to um, the process of photosynthesis. We'll talk about that a little bit more um, when we look at this picture. So as you can see, again, we're looking upward through the same forest. And what you notice is that there are trees that overlap other trees. So that means that the trees that are closest to the sun have the better opportunities for completing photosynthesis than those that are shaded by them, but that there are gaps. There's always gaps, and you can see places where no tree is really occupying the space completely. Um, this is this is an important aspect, and sometimes we think about, especially if you look at those beautiful David Attenborough videos with, flying over forested areas, it looks like it's continuous. But in fact, it's not. There are always these gaps to allow air movement to regulate temperature and humidity within the forest zone. And, and these are characteristics that offer some protection and some stability for the forest as well. Um, I did want to take a moment just to remind you, although I'm pretty sure that you learned about it in grade 3 and grade 7, and then maybe again in grade 11 if you were still taking biology at that point. Photosynthesis is a key process that trees undertake in order to combine carbon, which they gather from the atmosphere, and water, which they gather through their roots, using the energy that comes from the sun to make complex carbohydrate molecules. These are important because they're the building blocks of the trees, and they're the building blocks for chemicals that are used in the processes of growing and sexual reproduction. Photosynthesis is incredibly important for trees, for understory plants, and as you can see in this photo, only some trees are going to be able to do it fully. So the tree at the top right or top left-hand corner, sorry, of your screen is being shaded a little bit by that bigger one that's in the middle. And so it can't be completely efficient in its photosynthetic processes because it doesn't have full access to light. That means that the tree that does have full access needs to help make up the shortfall. And so what we're finding now is that trees actually support one another by sharing the carbon that they capture through the process of photosynthesis. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. There's three processes that are used to actually do the communication activity, the sending of signals. And it turns out sending of a lot more than just a signal. I want to talk about 3 areas. One is the root zone interactions that happen with fungus. The second one is chemical signaling, and the third one is hormones. Um, so the signals that are sent are in the form of chemicals always, but what gets translocated is not always in the form. Let's think about what happens in the root zone. Now, some of us have seen trees that look like this. That picture comes from Kew Gardens, for those of you who've been to the UK. And it's fairly typical to see some roots for most species at the top of the soil. What really happens, though, is better illustrated in this picture. And this is a picture of the balance of a tree between the portion that we can see, which is above ground, and the portion that we can't see, which is below ground. And in virtually all species, there is about a 50-50 balance, so that as much of the tree that you can see also exists below ground. It's a very intense, extensive network of roots. And that's because trees need to scavenge widely to get the nutrients and the water that they need. I think about our forest that I showed you the pictures of at the beginning of the talk, which is in Dummer Township. It's basically on a drumlin, which is made up of stones, big and small, some sand, not very much topsoil, not very much organic matter in the soil. And that means that it's really tough for the plants to actually get the water that they need. If you think about going to the beach and how quickly the sand rises up, or a wave washes in on the beach, and then in a second, you can't even see that it's wet anymore. That's what happens in sandy and stony soils. So plants compensate for that by growing something called root hairs. The epidermal cells of the root in the growing zone grow these projections, these little finger like projections. And they have one simple purpose, and that is to expand the surface area for interactions so that more water and more nutrients can be absorbed. I don't know why that shows twice. So, along with that, what we know is that even though we have all those root hairs, we just can't make up the amount of surface area for the absorption of water. And so, what happens is that plants form a symbiotic relationship with fungus. So, I've shown you a picture here in the top left hand corner of a tree root. And that tree root is completely surrounded, each piece of it is surrounded by fungal hyphae. Hyphae are the long filamentous strands of fungus that grow below the ground. And they have figured out that trees are a great source of carbon. And they need carbon because they can't do photosynthesis. So they snuggle up to the roots of the tree and they get carbon from the tree. The tree shares that in exchange for water and nutrients. Let's take a look at this in a little more detail. This is a series of images to show you what happens with a group of fungi that we call the ectomycorrhiza. So I don't know if you can see my arrow or not. No, I guess you can't. Okay. On the left-hand side, we have what's called a scanning electron micrograph, and it's showing you something which has been named the fungal sheath or the mantle. It's that network of fungal hyphae that completely surrounds the tip of a root. It's shown in purple in the middle image so that you can see around the whole root is this network of very, very, very tiny little fungal hyphae. And in fact, they actually penetrate the root and they go between the cells of the root. You can see in the very center of that picture that there's some of the purple fungal hyphae. That allows them to collect up the water and deliver it right inside the root, which is highly efficient. While they're there, they can also coax some carbon out of the tree roots. You can see on the right-hand side, that's another scanning electron micrograph, and it's showing those fungal hyphae in the cell walls. They have not penetrated the cells per se. And they're making a very intimate relationship with the tree roots. About 80% of trees form these relationships. So that's a whole lot of fungal hyphae. So again, I refer you back to the top left-hand corner just to see how extensive that that coating of fungal hyphae is on the tree roots. Now, fungus are their own organisms, shall we say. A lot of them, because of the nature of the relationship that they have with trees, really have no reason to form fruiting bodies. It's enough for them to get all of their carbon, and they don't actually need to form a fruiting body. Other plants, or sorry, other fungal species form fruiting bodies. And so the one that I'm showing you here, the top left-hand corner, is actually a beech tree. And it's formed a fungal association through these mycorrhizae, or the tiny fungal hyphae, with something which is very common here, the fly agaric. And every once in a while, um, the, uh, the fungus will form its natural fruiting bodies. So it's like the fungus has sort of two roles. One is that it needs to get its carbon so that it can, if it wants to, form fruiting bodies and have its own life cycle. But it also performs this function of providing water and nutrients. These ones, again, just to remind you, these are called ectomycorrhiza. The ecto is Latin for the outside, and it's completely different than the next one that I want to show you. So your ectomycorrhiza is top left-hand corner. Again, in a transverse sort of a view, you can see the mycorrhiza on the outside of the tree root. On the right-hand side, you'll see one which is called an endomycorrhiza. So endo, of course, is Latin for interior. And in this case, the the fungal hyphae not only grow around the outside, but they actually grow right into the plant cells. And the plant cell doesn't kick them out, it allows them in. They set up these little vesicles inside, and it allows them to have direct and immediate access to carbon as the tree is doing its photosynthesis. And of course, because science is always confusing, there's one down at the bottom, which is called an ectoendo mycorrhiza. It has both external hyphae and internal hyphae. There's not nearly as many of those as there are of either the ecto or the endomycorrhiza. I'm going to show you one more interesting one. These again are the endomycorrhiza. So you can see that there's the hyphae on the outside, and then they penetrate between the cell walls and eventually right into the plant cell. This is a picture that I took in the lab at one point. I've used some stain so that you can see the fungal hyphae pick up the really dark stain, and you can see them right inside the cells of the root, which appears sort of translucent. And these ones were also of a particularly interesting nature. This is my super sciencey part of the talk here, so sorry, you can have a nap if you need. Some plants form a tripartite symbiosis, so it's not just the fungus and the plant cells, but they also mix a bacteria in here, which is from the genus Actinomycetales frankia, and they are able to actually do nitrogen fixation so that the plant receives its nitrogen directly from the fungal hyphae. That one's a bit unusual. And we see it mostly in Ontario, actually. It's very common in Ontario, in alders, so shrubby plants more so than trees. Okay, end of the science commercial. There we go. Now, a lot of people will say to me, so how do you know any of this is true? How do you know that the tree is giving carbon to the mycorrhiza or the fungus? And how do you know that the fungus is going out there scavenging water and nutrients for the tree? How do we know that any of this is true? And it's a fair question. We know that it's true because we use isotopes to test it. And isotopes are forms of, in this case, carbon or nitrogen, using the same process as carbon dating. And so we can track where an individual carbon atom is coming from and where it's going to. And the same thing with nitrogen. So we're able to prove it both in the lab and in the field. I'm showing you a picture of a plant that I think is particularly interesting because it's the natural example of how this works. And this is a place where ancient wisdom comes in. So if you are an aficionado of any of the writings of our First Nations people, they talk about monotropa, which is the name of this plant, because of its unique characteristics. So this is a plant which is in the genera Ericaceae, which is quite common in Ontario. This particular plant is non-photosynthetic, so it cannot in any way make its own carbon. It has to derive its carbon some other way. So the way that it does it is with a special mycorrhiza, a special fungus, that selectively moves carbon to it along these mycorrhizal networks, these very complex networks, and it derives it from local conifer trees. So you'll always find these at the base of a conifer tree. And the carbon comes from the tree through the mycorrhiza network, through the fungal network, and it supports the plant through its own roots. And this one is a particularly nice example because it doesn't require that we carbon date it or any of that sort of stuff. It just happens quite naturally. So I'm not sure if any of you all have seen these around, but they are quite common in Ontario. You will know them as monotropa if you use something like iNaturalist to look them up. The traditional name for them is Indian pipe, and that is because that's the name, actually, the pipes is the name that our First Nations colleagues have chosen for them. All right, so some plants have a whole different system. They use chemical communications, and Some of you will be very familiar with this when I give you an example. The standard time-honored example is one of allelopathy. And allelopathy is simply a term that we use to talk about how plants exert a chemical influence on either another plant or could be another organism. It could be insects or even animals. Um, Typically, allelopathy is expressed in real time, so it happens immediately. And that happens when the chemical that we're talking about is passed through the fungal network. But allelopathy can also be expressed in sort of a secondary way, for example, through decomposing leaf litter. Nowadays, we don't call it allelopathy so much. We call the process the use of allelochemicals because allelopathy is sort of a negative term. It sounds like we're, the pathology part of that we're killing something, and that's one half of it. But the other part can be very positive, and so now we call them allelochemicals. If I say allelopathy, though, you're probably thinking about black walnut trees. So black walnuts are just one of a number of different species that have this impact. But you can see that there's, in this little pencil diagram, there's really nothing else growing in the understory of the black walnut. And that's because it makes a secondary metabolite from some of that carbon that it photosynthesizes. The metabolite is called juglone, and it emits it through its roots. It's picked up by the fungal hyphae, the mycorrhizal network, and it's spread out for quite a considerable distance, however large that network is that's getting its support from that tree. And the juglone is toxic to other plants. So it reduces the number of plants in the understory. If you've ever tried to have a flower bed underneath a black walnut tree, you'll know that it's generally not successful. Um, and I'm not sure exactly why it behaves this way, but it's very effective. It's also very effective at discouraging other organisms, such as insect pests and even mammals. So things like skunks and raccoons are really put off by the juglone, which is a very bitter taste and quite an uncomfortable sensation, I think, if someone was to try and eat the outer coating of the black walnuts. So in this image, you can see that the black walnut is having an effect on neighboring trees, and it will either reduce their capacity for growth or kill them outright. On the other hand, there's another whole allelo chemical reaction that goes on, which is a mechanism for one plant that has been damaged either by an insect pest or a pathogen to communicate with other plants in the area and give them a little bit of an advance warning that they might want to invoke their defense systems. You can see that there's a number of different chemicals across the top here, which are just representative of a whole group of chemicals that can be emitted from the leaves, or they can actually be sent through the fungal network as well. There are some chemicals which will damage the fungal network, and so that's a little counterproductive, I think. But evolution and coevolution is always one of trial and error. So the chemical signals can either be negative or they can be quite positive, depending on the particular situation and the type of threat that the plant is under. And finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about hormonal communication. So hormones are simply one subset of the chemicals, but they're quite specific and they're often in the form of pheromones. So when I say pheromones, you probably think about insects and the sex hormones of insects. But plants are quite capable of making pheromones too. Sometimes they use them in their own sexual reproduction, but sometimes they use them to mimic what's happening in other systems, other parts of the whole ecosystem. So I'm just going to tell you 3 little stories, one about caterpillars, one about giraffes, and then one about deer. And you can see 3 separate examples of how this all comes together. So everybody recognizes this. This is a gypsy moth larva, and it's munching away on a plant. It kind of looks like an apple leaf. Um, and the lower picture is what happens when a whole bunch of caterpillars have munched away on a whole bunch of trees. So earlier we talked about trees sequestering carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And some of that carbon is used in growth and development of the tree, of course, but some of it is used to produce a series of volatile organic compounds, and they're biogenic in nature. So these are called the BVOCs, or the BVOCs. And BVOCs can, they're a normal part of plant physiology. They can take as much as 1% of the carbon, which is sequestered through photosynthesis in a nice normal situation. A tree that's under serious attack take as much as 13% of the carbon that it's photosynthesizing and turn it into these BVOCs, which are used for a whole bunch of different reasons. BVOCs are manufactured in and are emitted from the leaves of, they have to be growing trees. You can't do this from a tree that's in a winter hiatus or something like that. And BVOCs have very characteristic scents for humans. So ones that you might think about are the scents for pines and spruce. You know, you're smelling your Christmas candle. Or things like eucalyptus. We use the essential oils of eucalyptus when we're at the spa or in the shower, for example. Um, these are all made up of isoprenes, and they're secondary metabolites that the tree manufactures as a course of its normal physiology. So let's go back up to our gypsy moth. When a caterpillar takes a bite out of a leaf, it causes a local reaction by the plant and the manufacture of a BVOC, which is emitted right at that leaf. It's better than GPS because it sends out a signal that says, this is a caterpillar, it's causing me damage right here. And it's in the form of a pheromone, which is designed to recruit a predator to come and eat the caterpillar. So the predator arrives. It's been lured in by a pheromone, which wasn't really real, but it has a reward when it gets there. It eats up the caterpillar, and all is well and good. And the plant has invested some energy in sending out that signal, but it's gotten quite a large reward. That works for a single caterpillar. What happens though when you have a whole stand of trees that are under attack by armies and armies and armies of caterpillars is that you get that first initial reaction exactly the same way. BVOCs are produced and they're designed to attract or recruit predators. But the other thing that happens is at the same time, when it's a massive infestation, is that the tree emits um, uh, other BVOCs, which are designed to act as signals for other trees to let them know that there's a threat in the area so that they can produce defensive secondary metabolites to prevent the damage that the caterpillar is going to cause in the first place. So one of the things that you need to know about BVOCs is that they're also really important in the both the manufacture and the control of ozone. And as we all know, it's important to have an intact ozone layer in the atmosphere because otherwise plants are subject to sunburn. So in an indirect way, when we have insect infestations, the defense mechanism of the plant, of the tree, can actually be damaging to the ozone layer. So that's not something that we talk about a lot these days, but it's something else that is of interest, I think. So I wanted to talk to you about a second example where pheromones are really important. And this is a by now classic story of communication between trees. And this happens in groves of acacia trees in Africa. Acacias, I've shown you a little blown up picture in the right hand corner up top. the acacia leaves because they're in the legume family or the pea family. So they're particularly important in Africa because they have an ability to sequester nitrogen. They also have high protein content in the leaves, and so they're a key species for giraffes to eat. So here we have a picture of a giraffe under an acacia tree. A couple of things you need to know about acacias. Because they're in the legumes, they produce pretty stiff, nasty spines all up and down their trunk when they're in their juvenile phase, and that protects them from most predators. When they become mature, like this one is, the spines fall away and they're not needed down below. But giraffes are the only things that can really eat from them. And they do, they're an important feed species for giraffes because of the high protein content in their leaves. So these two species have co-evolved for sure. There's no question in that. And so the tree has the need to protect itself from intensive herbivory because um, it, it is possible for the giraffe to eat enough of the tree to cause it some significant damage. So when the giraffe goes up and it munches on the tree responds by releasing potent secondary metabolites. They do this really swiftly, so swiftly, in fact, that it changes the flavor of the leaf. So it's a tannin component. So if you've ever had a cup of tea that's steeped too long and you know that bitterness, that's from tannins. So that's not very nice. In fact, if if you had other species of animals that were underneath the tree and you corralled them and didn't let them get away from the acacia trees, it can be so intense that it will actually kill species like kudu, for example, that would be in the same area. The other thing that happens with the tree is that it releases ethylene gas from the surface of the leaves of the tree, and ethylene is volatile, so it leaves quite quickly, and it it stimulates trees that are downwind from the one that's just been munched to create the defense mechanism, even though they don't have the trigger of the herbivory happening. So I think that's kind of an example that we can use that trees are actually sending signals to other trees. Um, Whether or not it's intended or not, that's up for debate. But um, I think it's really interesting that downwind trees will create this response. But of course, it's a co-evolution system. So giraffes have already figured out the next step. They've upped the ante, and they start at the most downward portion of the grove of trees, and they work their way upwind, so that every time they cause this reaction in the tree, they're moving for continuous feeding. They're moving to a tree that hasn't got that signal, hasn't received the signal from the other tree yet. Okay, so that one is kind of an interesting story. And then finally, I want to tell you the story about deer. So, as you all know, deer welcome the emergence of nice tender shoots in the spring. They feed pretty heavily on them. Um, they're trying to replenish the energy and the nutrients that they lost over the winter months. And we know because trees are successful, they're the unwitting victim. Check to make sure that, yes, okay, that they're unwitting victims in this situation. At least that's what we've always thought. But there's recently been some research completed at Leipzig University, and I think it was with the German Center for Biodiversity Research that completed the work. They were working with um, European beech and sycamore maple, and they wanted to see what happened to these species in terms of their response to the herbivory. So imagine the top nice buds in the top left-hand corner. They are going to get munched, and they want to know what the tree is going to do about that. So the research involved taking cuttings from these two species, so from European beech and sycamore maple. Um, they removed the tree buds mechanically using shears and chainsaws, and they watched what happened with the trees. And so, what happened initially was that the trees went about responding um, with a specific chemical cocktail, which is designed to prevent herbivory, and that's going to make some things that taste pretty nasty. Um, and then after they did that series of experiments, they tried them again, and this time they not only cut off the buds and the rapidly growing branches using mechanical devices again, so shears and chainsaws and that sort of thing, but then they went back over those spots with a little paintbrush that they dipped in deer saliva. I know, some lucky grad student, right? Um, and they got a completely different response because the tree recognized that deer saliva would be likely to contain bacteria that could cause secondary infections. So not only did they have the wound healing response, or sorry, the herbivory response, but they had a wound healing response as well to try and get around the bacteria that the deer might have introduced through their grazing. So again, these are all pheromone responses. All of the chemicals that are involved are in that pheromone grouping. So let's talk for a little bit about what's happening recently. Um, the concept of communication between individuals in the forest, it's an underpinning tenet of Aboriginal peoples all around the world. So there's a lot of the wisdom, ancient wisdom, to be learned from. In Canada, for example, the Coast Salish people call cedar the heart of their community. And cedar is intrinsic not only to their creation story, but to many other stories in their culture as well. First Nations hold similar belief about the tamarack in Ontario, for example, a number of different First Nations. And in general, what you find is that trees represent the deep roots of tradition and culture, and that individual trees will, in air quotations, speak their wisdom to leaders on issues about any of the core beliefs or core tenets of the culture. Trees that have the ability to communicate with other trees, as well as with humans and animals, are also very common in the folklore that we would have grown up with. Um, if you think about it for a minute, trees play roles in tales like um, the fairy tales of Hansel and Gretel. They protect the children on their escape flight, or Robin Hood, where the trees have a very active role to play in protecting um, the individuals that are of the common people, for example. Um, you can think about the role in The Wizard of Oz, where the apple trees are throwing apples, or in Avatar, where there's very much a role for the trees in sharing wisdom. Um, trees are often shown to have human traits, and they can communicate quite clearly, if not by words, then at least by their actions. So they have strong communicative roles in our folklore. Um, there are two modern authors that I want to talk to you about a little bit. The first is Paul Wallenben. He's a forester who lives just outside of the little town of Hummel in Germany, and he manages what's known as the Hummel Forest. Um, he he was a forester that worked for a forest company for many years, and he came to believe that trees had a whole different aspect to them. So he has fairly recently released a book which is called The Hidden Life of Trees: What They Feel and How They Communicate. And it is really an interesting read. A family member gave me a copy a few years ago at Christmas, and I have to say I really did enjoy the book. Um, he takes great pains in reframing how we think about trees and taking them from being those competitive loners that have been successful in the forest because they duked it out and they they competed more effectively for resources, to the idea of a forest as being the interconnection of many organisms that make up a superorganism, not unlike a colony of termites or a colony of bees, for example, where each individual has a role to play, but they're so interdependent, they really don't survive well alone. Um, his book places a lot of anthropomorphic, evocative descriptions around the trees. He is not shy about talking to you about what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And as a consequence, the scientific community has been pretty cautious about adopting what he's saying or promoting what he's saying, anyways, because they're pretty sure that trees don't feel emotions. Um, but nevertheless, a lot of what he has to say is really quite interesting, and I wouldn't discourage you in any way from reading the book. I think it looks like this. I don't know. Many of you may have already read it. The second person is a Canadian. Her name is Suzanne Simard. She's a professor at UBC, and she's a specialist in the temperate rainforest. She too has written a book, but it's a little bit different in that her work really explores the basic tenets of ancient wisdom of the First Nations in BC. And she works very, very hard to find the scientific underpinnings for those beliefs. And she does a lot of work in different aspects of soil and forest ecology. Um, I have read her book as well, and I think of the two, it's probably my favorite. It looks like this, and if you can find the book, it's worth a read. If you can't find the book, she has a really interesting and interactive website and seasonal uh, seasonal writings, which she calls dispatches from the mother tree, and they're often really, really interesting. She tells some very interesting stories, and because it's supported with good science, I think it's pretty believable. So these two authors are bringing the whole discussion into the forefront. Um, Both of them have a very solid understanding and support for the idea of the mycorrhizal network. They understand that we can't talk about just the trees without talking about the rest of the ecosystem. And particularly in the case of Dr. Simard, she's very focused on the importance of understanding the forest ecosystem so that we can best help it to be resilient in the face of global climate change, which is my little not so subtle segue into talking to you about climate change. Climate change is in the news everywhere. Um, it's a current topic of conversation. Right now, there is a conference going on for the last 4 days, which is an international conference. And I've been sort of following along and smiling to myself because many of the topics are the same ones that we were talking about some 20 years ago. I guess because I've been involved in climate change and looking at what it does to and for ecosystems for the last 20 years, it's probably only natural that that's where I wanted to end up with this talk tonight. The mycorrhizal networks are incredibly important in maintaining the health of a forest ecosystem. As you've heard me say, they're requisite for finding the water and the nutrients that trees and the entire ecosystem need, but they're incredibly susceptible to changes in temperature and the amount of water that's available in soils. And the downside is that climate change scientists are quick to point out that the impacts in Canada are going to be overall warmer temperatures, which mycorrhizae do not like, and overall drier conditions, which will impact their ability to function properly. So a change in the global climate will have a huge impact on the integrity of the forest ecosystem, if for no other reason that it has an impact on the fungal network. So that's one very important piece that I wanted to share with you, and something that we don't because we don't see what's going on below ground, it's fairly easy to ignore. A place where we can really see this is at the tree line, um, where the implications for Arctic plants are already quite evident. Arctic plants need immediate accessibility to water and nutrients because they have an incredible short growing season. And because that temperature and water regime is already changing, they're really suffering. So we're seeing a loss of biodiversity. Now, those are in small Arctic plants. There's not a whole lot of biodiversity at the tree line in tree species in Canada, anyways. Um, but but it will have implications there as well. And I think what looking at the Arctic plant biodiversity is teaching us is that this is having a huge impact on the mycorrhizal network. And if it's impacting the Arctic plants, it will also impact the forest. Final story that I wanted to tell you about is the story about the Great Bear Rainforest in BC. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to travel to BC or spend any time in that rainforest, but it is truly magnificent. It is the largest intact temperate rainforest in the world. Currently, it has an extremely high level of biodiversity, and that I think is something that we would want to preserve if at all possible. One of the interesting stories about the Great Bear Rainforest is that there's about 2,000 creeks and rivers that traverse that portion of the forest. So because they're coastal creeks and rivers, they're very, very important in their involvement in coastal salmon spawning. So let me tell my story about global climate change. The change in the global temperature has already had a tremendous impact on coastal water temperatures. And because of the coastal water temperature change, we're seeing changes in the pattern and in the number of salmon that are able to spawn every year. The salmon typically would have run into those 2,000 creeks and rivers to spawn. And some of them, to me, it sounds like a great number of them, would have become not only able to spawn, but once they were finished spawning, they would become a food source for bears in the rainforest. There is one river which is just outside of Prince Rupert where the numbers that have been put together show that in a typical season, about 6,200 kilograms of salmon were extracted from the river by bears, and of course make a major food source, not only for them, but also for secondary feeders like wolves and eagles. So about 2/3 of that 6,200 kilograms of salmon would be consumed by those predators. The important part of the story from my perspective is what happens to everything that's left. So that 1/3 of that salmon biomass is left to degrade on the forest floor. It's actually picked up by the mycorrhizal network as it degrades, and it's used, sure enough, to feed the trees. So this is the way climate change works. We have climate change that's affecting the ability of the salmon to spawn. Because they don't come into the river, they can't be caught by the bears. Because they can't be caught by the bears, they can't feed the trees. And so there's so many impacts that we really can't see from climate change, but they're very important to the health of the forest for sure. So this is a picture from Bella Coola, and it's just one of the tremendous trees that are in the Great Bear Rainforest. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to answer your first three questions for you, and then I would love to hear questions from you. So first of all, yes, this talk was recorded. It will be available for you from the Peterborough Stewardship website. Yes, I love to talk to people and answer questions. So if after all of this is over and done with, you have a question, phone me or email me. I'd be happy to have further discussion with you. And yes, the material that I used tonight was referenced with scientific references. I didn't put them all in because they're a little bit visually distracting, but if you need reference for it, I'm happy to share it with you. And now I just have to figure out how not to share my screen anymore so I can answer questions.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was a wonderful presentation, and I encourage everybody to start adding into the chat box if they have questions that they'd like to ask our lovely speaker. But while you're doing that, I just want to say that the presentation certainly makes you think twice about what it means to communicate, and just the variety and complexity of roles that you've taken us through for plants and mycorrhizal networks. It's certainly been very insightful. And as you've said, it really emphasizes the importance of understanding deeper forest ecology and the relationships that we see, not just above the surface, but under. And I think myself, as well as others, we tend to focus on those iconic megafauna species for climate change as like the campaigns, but you really can't underscore the importance of what's happening below the surface as well because of the interconnectedness of everything, like you said. And so just thank you so much for your insight tonight. It's been very interesting.
My pleasure.
And just a reminder to everybody, your microphones have been muted, but you can use the chat box to pose any questions that you might have.
Okay, so I have one that's come to me directly.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. The question comment that came in says, I've heard that earthworms may have an adverse effect on mycorrhizomes. Can you comment? This is actually a true fact. The first time I heard it, I kind of went, probably not possible, because worms are really interested in eating detritus, like leaves that have fallen down and that sort of thing. But they do have an adverse effect because of some of the excrement, and it changes the pH in the soil, and that can have a negative impact on mycorrhizae. Hope that answers your question.
Just while we wait to see if there's anything else, Susan, I was particularly interested in what you said about how mammals can also be impacted by the black walnut toxins that are transferred out through their fungal networks. And is that something that you've come across in studies that you've heard of, or is it more anecdotal evidence that they've observed in like specific interactions of individuals with black walnuts?
Sure. So if we go back to the black walnut story, juglone is definitely carried through the mycorrhizal network to quite a great extent. But juglone is also derived from leaf litter. So when the leaves fall off the tree and you get significant amounts of rain, as the trees break down, they give off juglone as well. And I think that's where the interaction with mammals actually happens, that it's sort of distasteful. There have also been studies that have shown that there's very high concentrations of juglone in the tissue that surrounds the developing walnut fruit. So you can imagine that as the walnut fruits fall off the tree, pretty much anything and everything is going to want to come and see if that fruit is good to eat, right?
Yeah.
And there's a period of time where the outside shell sort of rots off in order for the fruit to get to ground level so that it could sprout and make another black walnut tree. And during that time, if you read the studies, they basically show that things like squirrels and that might eat into that are really put off by the taste of the juglone.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any other questions come in yet, Susan, and you haven't received any privately yourself, have you?
No. Well, before this began, I was having a quick telephone call with my son, who, of course, I never get to see because of COVID. And I said to him, "Hey, if you got nothing else to do tonight, you might be interested in listening to this talk." And he said, "Oh, I was looking for something to put me to sleep." So it could be that your audience is just all sleeping. I don't know.
I think, yeah, I think that everyone's definitely been enjoying it. I will say that you definitely have a very soothing presenter voice as well. I don't know if you've ever been told
Yeah.
that before.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and some people are just expressing their thanks in the chat box here. Not much sleeping at all. It was great information.
okay, great.
Yeah. Well, maybe with that then, Susan, we'll wrap it up. But again, thank you so much on behalf of Peterborough County Stewardship and everybody that's joined us tonight for sharing your time and your knowledge and experience with every single one of us.
Yeah, no, it was fun. It's a whole different format doing it by Zoom.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Well, we're lucky to have you.
yeah, thanks everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye.